Well, first, I think there's about three things we need to consider here. One is that, of course, the idea, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which actually is the special education law, really encourages school-wide approaches like PBIS. In fact, in the congressional findings, when the idea was amended in 2004, they specifically listed school-wide behavior supports and whole school approaches. So the law, the special ed law, really encourages that. In fact, it also provides funding for school districts in the form of what are called early intervening services to fund whole school-wide approaches, such as multi-tiered systems. Secondly, in the Every Student Succeeds Act, there's funding for such programs. So it's important to understand the law really does encourage that, primarily as a way to address all children's needs when they're really young and early in their school career, and possibly identifying and ameliorating academic and functional problems. So the encouragement is one thing. Another thing is the idea specifically requires that IEP teams consider positive behavior interventions and supports in the IEPs of students who have problem behaviors. In fact, there have been court cases in which schools have been found not to be providing a FAPE as required by the law because they failed to include behavioral support in the student's IEP. A second important thing is really that it's kind of in the way of a warning that the U.S. Department of Education, which is obviously very supportive of whole school approaches such as PBIS, has issued memorandum and guidance to school districts in supporting such programs, but they also issued a warning that essentially such systems could potentially be a violation of what are called the child find components of the law if they're not used appropriately. And what I mean by that is, if a parent always has the right to request a special education evaluation. Now, if a parent goes to school personnel and asks for an evaluation for special education, there are only two appropriate responses. One response is, yes, we agree, your child should be evaluated for special education. Here are your procedural safeguards and a written consent form to let us go ahead with evaluation. Now, a school district personnel could also say, no, not at this time, we don't believe a evaluation is needed or is necessary. Here are your procedural safeguards, and here is a prior written notice in which we explain to you why we are not going to conduct an evaluation. And one reason could certainly be because we have data that show that your child is doing very well in our school-wide system, and in fact, we have data that show progress. That would be a perfectly legitimate reason to say no. What would not be legitimate is to say, well, we have this system, and your child has to go through it for 6 months before we'll even consider that. That would be illegal. You can't do that. So you have to remember those two responses are appropriate. And thirdly, the whole key really to balancing the requirements of the law and the requirements of a multi-tiered system like PBIS is a collection of data that shows progress. If you have data that shows progress, you're golden, because in essence, that would go into your procedural or your prior written notice that we have data that shows progress. On the other hand, if you have data that doesn't show progress, that would be a reason to conduct an evaluation. Also, to fail to include a youngster with disabilities in a school-wide PBIS system when all students are available, except students with disabilities, that could be a violation of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So it's very important that students with disabilities be included in such programs, and that school district personnel understand that there are some areas in which, if they have, for instance, suspensions and expulsions, those are the only areas that you really can't, because there is a different system for students who have an IEP or have a Section 504 plan. But nonetheless, students with disabilities should be included in school-wide systems, and any behavior supports should be included in the IEP that is being used and in the evaluation that is done. That data is very important and should be part of an evaluation to not only determine eligibility, but also to determine what instructional programming is important for the child.